Math 100, lesson 6.3, factoring trinomials, and this time A is not going to be 1. In section 2, A was 1, but today in section 3, A is not going to be 1. So our directions are still factor. And let's start with 5x squared minus 14x plus 8. All right, so anytime the directions tell us to factor, we always look for a greatest common factor first. Well, in this particular problem, there's not one. Okay, so that part's done. Once you make that decision, then you look at it and say, okay, it has 3 terms, it's a trinomial, so I'm going to do the 2 things that multiply to give me AC, that add to give me the B value. So again, I need to know what are A, B, and C. In this particular problem, my A is 5, my B is negative 14, and my C is 8. So this time, a little different with A not being 1. So over here, when I have my 2 blanks, something times something is going to be equal to 5 times 8, which is 40. And then 2 things that add together to be negative 14. This is what I'm looking for. Remember, whatever we put in the blanks has to be the same. All right, so the 2 numbers that would multiply to give me 40, but also add to give me negative 14 are negative 10 and negative 4. Notice that does give me positive 40 when I multiply, and it gives me negative 14 when I add. Remember, from here, you can do grouping or faux fractions. Now, the good news about today is that part hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is our A value is now 5 instead of 1. So, I'm going to do it both ways just so we can still see. Again, you only have to choose one way. You do not have to do both ways. And again, if you have another way that works, that's fine. Just make sure you show your work. All right, so if I do grouping, my first term comes down. My middle term gets replaced with the factors that I found, including x. So minus 10x, minus 4x, and then my last term comes down. Now I group. These two have a 5x in common. When I factor that out, I would have an x minus 2. Okay, my second group has a negative 4 in common. When I factor that out, I would have an x minus 2. Now my 2 groups have an x minus 2. So that gets factored out. Just as a little reminder, let me make sure we're all clear here. They both have this x minus 2, so it gets factored out front. We multiply by what is left, which would be 5x minus 4. So there's my factors. X minus 2 times 5x minus 4. Okay, if you chose to do faux fractions, we take our A value, in this case is 5, we put x with it, over one of the numbers we find. Our A value with x over the other number we find. Now, when we were doing 6.2, I told you if at any point we could simplify my faux fraction, that I should, and I can this time. This one is 1x over negative 2. Now I read my fraction just like I was reading it in 6.2. So I would have x minus 2 times 5x minus 4. Notice my factors here are exactly what I got when I did the grouping method. So whichever method you like the best is the one that you need to do. Okay, let's practice a little bit more. All right, let's try these 2. I'm sorry, this 1. So is there a greatest common factor? Always looking for that first. There's not. It is a trinomial. So I'm going to do 2 things that multiply to be whatever A times C is. 2 things that add to be whatever b is. So I need to know what are a, b, and c. My a value is 6, my b value is 19, and my c value is -7. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to be -42. Remember, a times c. Two things that add to be 19. That is our b value. All right, so looking for two numbers that when I multiply them, I'm going to get 42, but when I add them, I'm going to get 19. All right, so 21 times -2 does give me -42. 21 plus -2 does give me +19. So I found my numbers. You may do grouping or faux fractions. I am going to choose to do faux fractions. It is my favorite. So I take my a value with x, put it over one number I found. My a value with x, put it over the other number I found. If either fraction can simplify, you must. They can both simplify. 3 goes into 6 2 times, and 3 goes into 21 7 times. Okay, and this one also simplifies. 2 goes into 6 3 times, and 2 goes into itself, -1. So now I read it from top to bottom. That says 2x plus 7 times 3x minus 1. It is perfectly okay if you chose to do grouping or some other method, as long as you show your work. All right, so these can get a little tricky. The better you are at multiplying, obviously the easier these are. If it takes you a little while to find the numbers that multiply to give you -42 and add to give you 19, this takes a little bit longer. Just make sure that you are showing your work. Okay, let's do one more that only has one variable, and then we'll do one that has two variables. All right, anytime we're asked to factor, we always look for the greatest common factor first. There's not one here. So this is a trinomial. I am going to find two numbers that multiply to be AB, that multiply to be AC, and add to be B. So I need to know what are A, B, and C. A is 3, B is -1, and C is -10. So A times C is -30, and my B value is -1. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to give me -30. Those same two numbers have to add to be -1. So -6 and +5. So just double check that, make sure you understand. Okay, this time I'll do grouping and faux fractions. I know for some of you that do grouping, that last problem frustrated you because I did not do both ways. All right, grouping. First term comes down. Second term gets replaced with the two that I found, including x. And the last term comes down. So now when I group the first two, they have a 3x in common. When I factor that out, I get x minus 2. Second group has a +5 in common. When I factor it out, I get an x minus 2. Now my two groups have an x minus 2 in common. I factor that out, and I'm left with multiplied by 3x plus 5. Okay, if you chose faux fractions, my a value is 3. It gets an x, and it goes over one number I found. My a value is 3. It gets an x, goes over the other number I found. If you can simplify, you do. This one will. So I get 1x over -2. Now I read it top to bottom to get my factors. So x minus 2 times 3x plus 5. Again, my factors are exactly what I found before. So our steps are really not different if you chose to do grouping or fractions. We just, A is not 1 this time. If you go through the steps even when A is 1, then it doesn't change much for you. You still make sure you do all the steps. Okay, now let's do one I told you that has 2 variables. We're still factoring. All right, looking for our greatest common factor. There's not one. Always have to check for that first. All right, it is a trinomial, so I'm going to try to multiply 2 things to get AC. I'm going to add 2 things to get B. So I need to know what are A, B, and C. All right, my variable here is x squared. My variable here is x. So when I decide what is A is everything other than x squared, so it's 3. It's the coefficient of x squared. B is everything other than x, so negative 13y. And C is everything you see there, 4y squared. So when I multiply A times C, I get 12y squared. And my B value is negative 13y. So when I'm looking for 2 numbers to multiply to give me positive 12y squared, I would use negative 12y times negative 1y. Because those same 2 things, when I add them, I get negative 13y. I'm going to do faux fractions. It's my favorite. So my A value is 3. It gets an x. It goes over one value I found. My A value gets an x. It goes over the other value I found. If you can simplify, you do. 3 goes into itself once. It goes into negative 12 negative 4 times. So I read my factors. I would have x minus 4y times 3x minus y. That would be my factors, even if you did grouping. Now, if you get to work in these problems and you've got some questions, which you very well may, make sure that you, if you're going to email me, please make sure you first tell me which class you're in, and then maybe a picture of your problem so I can see what you have done so I can help correct you. And we will move on to 6.4, which talks about special forms in our next video.